The moment he stopped responding, she checked her phone again and again. Not because he was extraordinary, not because he was rare, but because he disappeared. That silence did more damage than 100 compliments ever could. I learned this the hard way. Attraction doesn't grow from reassurance. It grows from tension, from distance, from not knowing where you stand. Men are taught to pursue harder when interest feels unstable, to explain more, to give more, to close the gap. But the gap is the point. The space between wanting and having is where desire breathes. When you remove it, attraction suffocates. The man who is always available becomes invisible. The man who withdraws becomes unforgettable. This isn't about tricks. It isn't about cruelty. It's about value. About what happens when someone realizes they can't access you on demand. When your absence weighs more than your presence ever did. That's when the balance shifts. That's when obsession begins. If you felt this pattern before but couldn't name it, stay with me. Before we begin, leave a comment with your location and local time. And if this perspective resonates, subscribe. Quiet clarity is rare, and it changes everything. I didn't understand this pattern at first. I thought attraction was built through effort, through consistency, through showing up early and staying late. I believed that if I proved my interest clearly enough, the outcome would follow. That belief cost me years. I watched the same sequence repeat itself. The women who received the most attention lost interest the fastest. The ones who were chased relentlessly became distant. Meanwhile, the men who did less, who said less, who seemed half a step removed from the interaction, became the center of fixation. At first, I dismissed it as coincidence. Then, I saw it happen too many times to ignore. There was a woman named Emily. Intelligent, calm, warm in a measured way. When I met her, the connection felt easy. Conversations flowed. Laughter came without effort. I did what I had always done. I followed up quickly. I stayed engaged. I made myself available. I thought momentum was something you had to protect. A week later, she was slower to respond. A few days after that, plans were vague. I adjusted. I leaned in. I clarified. I tried to stabilize what felt like a shift. The more I did, the less present she became. Eventually, she stopped altogether. No explanation, no confrontation, just distance. Around the same time, I noticed something else. A friend of mine, Mark, barely reacted when a woman pulled away. He didn't ask questions. He didn't fill the silence. He didn't explain himself. He continued his life as if nothing had changed. And strangely, they always came back. Not immediately, but eventually. Curious, invested, more interested than before. That contrast forced me to confront something uncomfortable. Attraction wasn't responding to intention. It was responding to position. Women weren't losing interest because men weren't good enough. They were losing interest because the dynamic collapsed. The moment certainty replaced tension, desire faded. Not because women wanted chaos, but because certainty removed imagination. When everything was known, nothing was felt. I began paying attention to what actually triggered emotional engagement. It wasn't compliments. It wasn't reassurance. It wasn't consistency. It was uncertainty. The unanswered question. The open loop. The feeling that something wasn't fully secured yet. This went against everything I had been taught. Men are trained to pursue directly. Identify the target. Move forward. Close the distance. Women don't operate that way. Their attraction unfolds through evaluation, through resistance, through testing emotional stability rather than emotional intensity. When a woman pulls back, it's rarely accidental. It's a signal, not a rejection, but a probe. She is watching what happens next. Does the man panic? Does he chase? Does he explain? Does he need immediate reassurance? Or does he remain unchanged? Most men fail here. They treat the pullback as a problem to solve instead of a moment to observe. They rush to reestablish contact. They fill the silence with questions. They offer clarity where none was requested. And in doing so, they answer the question she never asked. He needs me more than I need him. That realization kills attraction quietly. There is no argument, no dramatic ending, just a gradual withdrawal of emotional investment. She doesn't feel pulled anymore. She feels needed. And need is heavy. It creates pressure. It demands maintenance. Desire doesn't survive under that weight. I started to see that attraction is less about what you do and more about what you don't disrupt. The tension between interest and uncertainty is fragile. Most men destroy it by trying to control it. When a woman knows exactly where she stands, she stops standing there. When she knows she has access at any moment, the urgency disappears. When she knows the outcome, the story ends. Human beings don't obsess over what they already own. They obsess over what feels unfinished. The men who triggered attraction weren't aloof. They weren't cold. They simply didn't rearrange their internal state based on her behavior. They didn't rise when she leaned in or fall when she pulled away. Their emotional center stayed put. That steadiness created contrast. Her emotions fluctuated. His did not. That imbalance generated curiosity. Why isn't he reacting? Why isn't he chasing? Why doesn't he seem affected? Those questions did more than any message ever could. I also noticed something else. The men who held attraction had lives that continued regardless of romantic interest. Not performatively busy, actually engaged. Work, training, commitments. Goals that required presence. Their attention wasn't a faucet that could be turned on demand. It had to be earned through timing and alignment. That alone changed how they were perceived. Access became meaningful because it wasn't guaranteed. The mistake most men make is believing attraction is something you generate through effort. In reality, it's something you preserve through restraint. You don't build desire by adding more. You build it by not removing what makes it possible. Uncertainty isn't confusion, it's space. Space for imagination, space for anticipation, space for emotional investment to grow on her side instead of being handed to her fully formed. I had to confront my own behavior. I realized I was using communication to regulate anxiety, texting to feel secure, calling to feel connected, clarifying to avoid discomfort. None of that was about her, it was about me. The needy man isn't driven by desire. He's driven by fear. Fear of losing, fear of being replaced, fear of not being chosen. And that fear leaks into everything. The speed of response, the tone, the length, the urgency. Women don't analyze it consciously. They feel it. And what they feel is imbalance. Attraction requires polarity. One person leaning emotionally while the other remains grounded. When both lean at the same time, the tension collapses. When the man leans harder than the woman, the polarity reverses. She becomes the stable one. He becomes the variable, and desire drains away. I stopped trying to prove interest. I stopped chasing clarity. I stopped responding to every shift as if it required correction. I allowed distance without filling it, silence without explanation, ambiguity without panic, not as a tactic, as a boundary. What changed wasn't just how women responded, it was how I experienced dating. I was no longer waiting, no longer monitoring. no longer over-invested in outcomes that hadn't been earned. My attention returned to my life, and that shift did something unexpected. Attraction followed. Not because I demanded it, not because I pursued it, but because I stopped removing the conditions that allow it to exist. Once I saw the pattern, I couldn't unsee it. What I had mistaken for disinterest was often something else entirely. It was a test. Not a conscious one, not a manipulative scheme, but a natural evaluation. A woman pulls back to see what remains when her presence is no longer guaranteed. Men interpret that moment as danger. Something is slipping. Control is being lost. They react by accelerating. More messages, more reassurance, more effort. They believe attraction increases with pressure. In reality, pressure exposes weakness. Women don't chase the way men do. Men move forward. Women pull away and observe. The chase happens in the space created by resistance. When there is no resistance, there is nothing to chase. I watched this play out again and again. A woman would cancel plans, or respond slower, or grow quiet for a few days, and the man would react as if the floor had dropped beneath him. He would ask what was wrong. He would try to reschedule immediately. He would attempt to restore the previous dynamic by force. What he didn't realize was that she wasn't asking for repair. She was watching for stability. Does he hold his ground when things are uncertain, or does he collapse inward? Does his mood depend on her availability, or does his life continue untouched? These moments reveal everything. A man who chases in response to distance communicates one thing clearly. He has no internal anchor. His emotional state is outsourced. When she leans away, he leans forward to compensate. And the harder he leans, the more off balance he appears. Attraction doesn't grow toward instability. It moves away from it. The men who passed these moments didn't do anything impressive. They simply didn't react. Not with indifference, with continuity. They stayed on course. They didn't ask for explanations. They didn't fill silence with concern. They didn't chase what stepped back. And that non-reaction became the reaction. She expected pressure. She expected pursuit. She expected him to try to regain footing. When none of that happened, a question formed. Why isn't he trying harder? Why isn't he affected? That question creates tension. Tension creates focus. Focus creates desire. This is where most men misunderstand the idea of being a challenge. They think it means withholding affection, playing cold, creating distance deliberately. That's not what works. That's performance. And performance is unstable. Real challenge comes from something else, from having a center that doesn't shift when circumstances do, from not needing immediate emotional resolution, from being able to sit in ambiguity without trying to escape it. A woman testing emotional stability isn't trying to punish a man. She's trying to determine whether he can hold ground when conditions change. Relationships are not stable environments. Emotions fluctuate. Stress appears. Distance happens. If a man cannot handle early uncertainty, he won't handle later pressure. So she watches. When a man explains himself too quickly, he reveals insecurity. When he justifies his value, he signals doubt. When he demands clarity, he shows fear of the unknown. All of this is information, and none of it is attractive. I realize that attraction responds to what remains unsaid more than what is expressed. The unanswered space forces her to engage internally. When everything is explained, there is nothing left to feel. The men who became puzzles didn't try to be mysterious. They simply didn't overexpose themselves. They didn't narrate their inner world. They didn't document every emotion. They allowed parts of themselves to remain unconfirmed. That absence invited curiosity. Curiosity is the engine of desire. Without it, attraction becomes static, comfortable, predictable, and predictable things are easy to replace. Most men believe women want certainty. They don't. They want emotional safety, not emotional closure. Safety comes from consistency of character. Closure comes from explanation. One builds attraction, the other ends it. When a woman pulls away and the man responds with calm continuity, something shifts. The power dynamic resets, not through dominance, through self-possession. She feels his independence. She senses that his emotional well-being isn't contingent on her approval. And that realization creates a strange inversion. The one who stepped back begins to lean forward. I saw this repeatedly. Women who went quiet reappeared days later. Not because the man chased, but because he didn't. His lack of reaction created unresolved tension, and unresolved tension demands resolution. Silence, when it comes from strength, speaks loudly. I also noticed how men fail these moments in subtle ways. They don't always beg. Sometimes they disguise neediness as politeness, checking in, making sure everything is okay, offering flexibility, being understanding. All of it seems reasonable. All of it communicates the same thing. I am waiting. Waiting is not attractive. It signals suspension. It places the man in a passive role. His life pauses until she decides. The man who continues forward doesn't wait. He proceeds, not away from her, forward in his life, and that forward motion creates gravity. The idea that women want men to jump through obstacles is misunderstood. They want to see if obstacles stop you from being yourself, if resistance derails your direction, if uncertainty destabilizes your frame. The man who changes course when tested is easy to control. The man who doesn't is hard to place. And what is hard to place becomes interesting. This is why overreaction is fatal. Not because it shows interest, but because it shows lack of self-regulation. Emotional volatility, even when expressed as enthusiasm, reads as risk. It suggests that pressure will produce collapse. A woman doesn't want to manage a man's emotions. She wants to feel regulated by his presence. That regulation begins early, in moments where uncertainty appears and he remains unchanged. The men who become addictive are not exciting in the obvious sense. They are stable in a world of fluctuation. That contrast stands out. When I stopped reacting to tests, the tests stopped escalating. There was nothing to push against, no leverage to pull. And in that neutrality, attraction either emerged or disappeared cleanly. Both outcomes were acceptable. That was another shift. I no longer needed every interaction to work. Rejection stopped feeling personal. Distance stopped feeling threatening. Because my identity wasn't tied to being chosen. That detachment didn't make me cold, it made me clear. Attraction isn't built by convincing. It's revealed through contrast. And the moment you stop trying to control the dynamic, you allow it to show you what it actually is. The most destructive mistakes men make don't look dramatic. They look reasonable. They look polite. They look caring. And that's why they're so hard to correct. I used to believe that clarity was strength, that defining things early showed confidence, that addressing distance directly prevented misunderstanding. In reality, it did the opposite. It exposed impatience. It revealed insecurity. It collapsed attraction before it had time to form. The moment a man senses uncertainty, his instinct is to eliminate it. He wants to know where he stands. He wants reassurance. He wants confirmation that he's not wasting his time. That urgency doesn't come from desire, it comes from fear. Fear of being replaced, fear of being forgotten, fear of investing without guarantee. That fear drives men to rush intimacy, to push for definition, to demand emotional transparency before it exists naturally. They mistake early ambiguity for danger when it is actually the environment where attraction grows. I watched men sabotage themselves by asking the wrong questions too soon. What are you looking for? Where do you see this going? Do you like me? These questions aren't neutral. They shift the dynamic. They place the woman in the position of evaluator and the man in the position of applicant. The moment you ask for evaluation, you lower your position. Attraction doesn't grow upward toward those seeking approval. It flows toward those who appear self-contained. Another mistake is over-explaining. When a woman pulls back slightly, many men rush to justify themselves. They clarify intentions. They explain behavior. They try to remove any possible doubt. But doubt is not the enemy. Doubt is the fuel. When you explain yourself without being asked, you signal defensiveness. You suggest that her perception holds authority over your value. You teach her that if she applies pressure, you will respond by proving yourself. That pattern is easy to exploit and impossible to respect. Men also underestimate how much information they leak through speed. Fast responses, immediate availability, instant emotional engagement. None of it is inherently bad. But when it is constant, it communicates one thing clearly. Nothing else competes for your attention. Value is always contextual. Something desired by many feels valuable. Something always available feels disposable. When you respond instantly, every time you remove scarcity. When you rearrange your schedule immediately, you remove significance. When you prioritize her before she has earned that place, you reverse the natural order. The man becomes the investment. She becomes the selector. Attraction does not survive that reversal. I saw men destroy momentum by trying to be understanding. She cancels plans. He reassures her, tells her it's okay, offers alternatives, tries to adapt. On the surface, it looks mature. Beneath it, it communicates flexibility without boundaries. Boundaries are not rules. They are indicators of self-respect. A man without boundaries will always overextend. And overextension looks like need. Neediness doesn't announce itself loudly. It whispers through behavior, through checking in too often, through filling silence, through monitoring response times, through interpreting every interaction as a referendum on worth. The needy man needs certainty because uncertainty threatens him. He cannot sit in the unknown. He treats ambiguity like a problem to solve instead of a condition to tolerate. But tolerance of uncertainty is power. The ability to not know and remain grounded is rare. And rarity creates attraction. I had to confront my own patterns. I realized I was trying to lock things down before they had formed. I wanted guarantees before value was established. I wanted exclusivity before exploration. I wanted emotional safety before emotional depth. All of that was backwards. You don't secure attraction by tightening your grip. You secure it by showing that you don't need to grip at all. Another silent killer is predictability. When she knows exactly when you'll text, exactly how you'll respond, exactly what you'll say, anticipation dies. You become emotionally flat, reliable but uninspiring. Predictability creates comfort. Comfort is not attraction. Comfort is maintenance. Early attraction requires tension, not conflict. Tension The subtle uncertainty of not fully knowing where you stand, the sense that something is still unresolved, the feeling that effort still matters. Men kill this by being too transparent too early, by sharing everything, by explaining intentions in detail, by narrating their interest before it has been earned. Mystery is not deception. It is restraint. She doesn't need to know you thought about her all day. She doesn't need to know you cleared your schedule for her. She doesn't need to know she is your primary focus after 2 dates. Those truths don't build attraction. They remove leverage. The man who reveals everything too soon leaves nothing to discover later. He becomes a story already told, and stories already told don't hold attention. I learned that attraction responds to pacing, not speed, not intensity. Pacing, the gradual unfolding of access, the measured release of attention, the alignment of investment over time. When a man gives everything immediately, he trains her nervous system to expect nothing later. The arc flattens. Interest fades. Another mistake is treating every interaction as critical. Overanalyzing messages, replaying conversations, reading meaning into delays. This internal pressure leaks outward. Even when unspoken, it shapes tone. It makes communication heavy. Attraction requires lightness, not humor. Lightness of emotional weight. When everything feels consequential, nothing feels inviting. I stopped treating early dating like a negotiation. I stopped trying to optimize outcomes. I stopped adjusting myself to secure approval. And something shifted. The dynamic stopped feeling fragile. I no longer felt like one wrong move would end everything. That internal stability changed how I showed up. And how I showed up changed how I was perceived. Women didn't respond to effort. They responded to presence. Calm, boundaries, continuity. The biggest mistake men make is trying to manufacture attraction instead of protecting the conditions that allow it to emerge. You don't need to do more. You need to stop doing what undermines you. The moment that exposes everything is simple. She cancels the date. It doesn't matter why. Work ran late. Family issue. Not feeling well. The reason is irrelevant. What matters is what happens next. Because in that small window, most men reveal exactly who they are. I used to believe cancellation was a problem to fix, a disruption that required immediate response. I thought the correct move was to reassure her to show flexibility to preserve momentum. So I reacted quickly. I asked when she was free. I offered alternatives. I tried to reschedule before the space had time to exist. And every time I did, something shifted. The more I tried to salvage the plan, the less interest I felt on the other side. Replies became shorter. Energy dropped. The connection thinned. Nothing dramatic happened. It just quietly dissolved. I didn't understand why until I stopped reacting. A canceled date is not rejection. It's a test of frame, a moment where uncertainty enters the dynamic. She's watching what you do when access is removed. Do you scramble? Do you compensate? Do you attempt to regain control? Or do you accept the change and continue forward without adjustment? Most men expose need immediately. They respond fast. They check if everything is okay. They try to lock down another date. They soften their tone. Each move communicates the same thing. This mattered more to me than it did to you. Neediness broadcasts through behavior, not words. It shows in speed, urgency, repetition, and emotional weight. And it is felt instantly. When you try to reschedule immediately, you're telling her you have nothing else competing for your time. When you follow up repeatedly, you're telling her you're already emotionally invested. When you seek reassurance, you're telling her you cannot tolerate ambiguity. None of that is attractive. I watched men talk themselves out of desire by over-communicating. They thought they were being considerate. They were actually revealing dependency. Silence, on the other hand, is often misunderstood. Silence is not punishment. It's not manipulation. It's not withdrawal. It's composure. When I stopped reacting to cancellations, something unexpected happened. Women reached back out on their own, sometimes days later, sometimes weeks. The same women who had gone quiet returned with renewed interest, not because I punished them, because I didn't chase them. Silence communicates self-sufficiency. It says your life continues regardless of her availability. It says you don't need immediate validation. It says your happiness isn't dependent on one plan working out. That message carries weight. When a man remains calm in the face of disruption, he demonstrates emotional stability. And emotional stability is one of the strongest attraction triggers there is. I learned to respond differently. Short, neutral, grounded, no worries. Let me know when you're free. That was it. No follow-up questions. No reassurance. No effort to maintain momentum artificially. The interaction remained open without pressure. That restraint preserved tension. It left something unresolved. It allowed her to feel the absence of pursuit. And that absence forced her to evaluate. Is he really okay with this? Did I misjudge his interest? Why isn't he trying harder? Those questions do the work you shouldn't. Men think attraction comes from demonstrating interest. It doesn't. It comes from allowing the other person to invest emotionally. And investment only happens when there is space to do so. When you remove that space by rushing to fix things, you remove the opportunity for her to lean in. The cancellation scenario exposes another mistake. Men often assume that being flexible shows strength. In reality, flexibility without boundaries shows low self-value. A man who can adapt endlessly has no structure, and structure creates safety. Safety is not availability. It is consistency of self. When I stopped reorganizing my life around potential dates, my time became valuable. Not because I withheld it, but because it was already allocated. Work, training, commitments, goals that mattered. If she canceled, those things didn't disappear. They continued. That continuity changed everything. Women could feel that they were stepping into an already full life, not becoming the center of an empty one. And that distinction matters more than men realize. The man who drops everything for a maybe date sends a clear signal. He has nothing else going on. His world is small. His options are limited. His interest is inflated by scarcity. Scarcity creates pressure. Pressure kills attraction. I also learned that you don't need to match her emotional shifts. If she's uncertain, you don't need to compensate with certainty. If she's distant, you don't need to close the gap. If she's inconsistent, you don't need to stabilize the dynamic. Your job is not to manage her emotions, manage her. Your job is to maintain your own. When a woman cancels and you remain unchanged, you demonstrate leadership, not control. Leadership of self. You show that external events don't dictate your internal state. That quality is rare, and rarity attracts. Men fear that if they don't act, they'll be forgotten. The opposite is true. The man who doesn't act out of fear stays present in her mind, because his lack of reaction creates contrast. Most men react the same way, urgently, predictably, desperately. The man who doesn't stands out immediately. That moment taught me something essential. Attraction is not lost in silence. It is lost in overreaction. The canceled date isn't the end, it's the mirror. And what it reflects depends entirely on how you show up when plans fall apart. The difference between being wanted and being needed is subtle, but it defines everything. I didn't understand that distinction for a long time. I thought wanting and needing were just different intensities of the same thing. They are not. They sit on opposite ends of attraction. Need is rooted in lack. It says something is missing and must be filled. Choice is rooted in abundance. It says something is present and can be offered selectively. One repels, the other pulls. Most men approach dating from need without realizing it. Not because they are weak, but because they have been conditioned to measure worth through selection. Being chosen feels like validation. Rejection feels like erasure. So they seek certainty early. They seek confirmation. They seek assurance that their investment is safe. That impulse is understandable. And it is fatal to attraction. The moment a man needs to know where he stands, he has already given away his position. He has placed his emotional security in someone else's hands. He has made her reaction more important than his direction. Attraction does not move toward that posture. When I looked closely at the men women leaned toward, I saw a pattern. They were not indifferent. They were decisive. They did not seek to be chosen. They chose. And that difference changed the entire dynamic. Choosing implies standards. It implies evaluation. It implies that access to you is not automatic. The man who chooses is not waiting to be validated. He is assessing alignment. That orientation creates polarity immediately. The needy man is waiting. The choosing man is moving. Waiting creates pressure. Moving creates momentum. I realized that many of my actions were driven by the fear of losing rather than the desire to build. I wasn't asking myself if the woman in front of me was right for my life. I was asking if I was right for hers. That reversal turned me into a contestant. Contestants perform. They overextend. They explain. They try to impress. They seek approval. And the one who seeks approval cannot be desired. Desire requires asymmetry. One person leans emotionally, while the other remains grounded. When the man leans first, the polarity collapses. I had to change how I framed early interactions. I stopped thinking in terms of outcome. I stopped measuring progress by reassurance. I stopped chasing emotional milestones. Instead, I focused on one thing: whether my life felt intact regardless of how the interaction unfolded. That internal check changed everything. When you don't need the outcome, you stop forcing it. When you don't need validation, you stop performing. When you don't need certainty, you stop interrogating the moment. That calm detachment is often misread as confidence. It's not. It's independence. Women are not attracted to men who don't care. They are attracted to men who don't need. There is a difference. Caring adds warmth. Need adds pressure. Pressure collapses attraction because it removes freedom. When a woman senses that her response carries too much weight, she pulls away, not to punish, to breathe. Choice feels light. Need feels heavy. I began to notice how often men confuse clarity with leadership. They believe that defining the relationship early shows strength. In reality, it often shows impatience. Leadership isn't about forcing definition. It's about allowing things to reveal themselves without pressure. The man who can walk away without resentment is the man who has options. Options don't have to be romantic. They can be purpose, direction, standards. A life that does not hinge on one person's interest. When a woman senses that a man has options, something changes. Not because she fears competition, but because options signal value. They suggest that his attention is not cheap, that his presence must be earned. That sense of being chosen rather than chased is powerful. Chasing feels like being pursued because the other person is afraid to lose you. Being chosen feels like being selected because you stand out. Women don't want to be chased, they want to be selected. The love story they respond to isn't "he wanted me so badly." It's "he could have chosen many paths, and he chose me." That narrative only works if it's true. The man who needs her cannot choose her freely. He requires her. And requirement kills romance. It turns desire into obligation. I saw this play out repeatedly. Men who invested heavily early lost leverage quickly. Men who paced their investment retained it. Not by withholding affection, but by aligning it with earned connection. Investment should be reciprocal and proportional. When one side invests far more than the other, imbalance forms. And imbalance breeds discomfort. The woman feels it. She may not articulate it, but she senses the weight of expectation, the fear of disappointing, the responsibility of being someone's emotional anchor before trust is formed. That burden pushes her away. When I stopped placing emotional weight on early interactions, the dynamic lightened. Conversations became easier. Dates became more relaxed. There was no urgency to define, no pressure to progress. Things unfolded at their own pace. And when they didn't, it didn't destabilize me. That stability is what allowed attraction to grow where it was meant to, and to dissolve cleanly where it wasn't. Needing someone to choose you makes you small. Choosing someone because they align with your life makes you grounded. The shift from need to choice isn't something you perform. It's something you build. It comes from having a life that stands on its own. A sense of direction that doesn't pause for approval. Standards that don't bend under pressure. When those elements are in place, you don't chase. You don't wait. You don't ask to be chosen. You decide. And that decision made quietly and without demand is what creates the attraction most men spend their lives trying to manufacture. Predictability is the silent killer of attraction. It doesn't end things loudly, and it erodes them quietly until nothing is left to feel. I used to believe consistency was always a virtue. Show up the same way, respond the same way, be reliable. And while those qualities matter later early on, they create a problem. When everything about you is easy to read, there is nothing left to discover. Attraction needs movement, not chaos. Movement between knowing and not knowing, between presence and absence, between warmth and distance. When that movement disappears, attention fades. The men who were hardest to forget weren't confusing. They were incomplete in the right way. There was always something unresolved, something not fully defined. Their interest wasn't unclear. Their availability was. Mystery is not about lying. It's about pacing access. Most men destroy mystery by oversharing. They narrate their interest. They document their thoughts. They explain their intentions in detail. They remove all uncertainty under the belief that transparency builds trust. Trust is not built by exposure. It is built by consistency over time. Exposure without time feels premature, and premature intimacy feels unsafe. I learned that the phone is the fastest way to kill mystery. Texting creates the illusion of connection without the substance. Men use it to regulate anxiety, to feel close, to maintain presence. In doing so, they empty the interaction of anticipation. Long text conversations flatten attraction. Hours-long phone calls eliminate curiosity. Sharing your story digitally removes reasons to meet. The man who reveals everything through messages leaves nothing to experience in person. He becomes familiar before he becomes meaningful. I changed how I used communication. The phone stopped being a source of comfort. It became a tool. I used it to set dates, not to replace them. I stopped filling space with words. I allowed silence to exist. Silence invites imagination, and imagination is where desire lives. When a woman doesn't hear from you immediately, her mind fills the gap. What is he doing? Who is he with? Why isn't he reacting like everyone else? Those questions keep you present in her mind without effort. Delayed responses are not a tactic. They are a byproduct of having priorities. When your attention is divided between things that matter, you cannot respond instantly. And that reality creates unpredictability. Unpredictability doesn't mean inconsistency of character. It means variability of availability. You're the same person. Your access is not guaranteed. That distinction is critical. Sometimes you initiate, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you're free, sometimes you're not. Not to manipulate, but because that's how full lives operate. People with nothing going on are consistent. People with direction are variable. The man who is too easy to read is too easy to leave. When she knows exactly when you'll reach out, exactly how you'll react, the emotional stakes drop. There is no tension, no anticipation, no investment. Mystery creates the emotional rhythm that keeps interest alive. The highs of connection, the lows of distance. The uncertainty that gives meaning to certainty when it arrives. This isn't about creating emotional instability. It's about not eliminating it prematurely. Most men are afraid of being forgotten. They overcommunicate to stay relevant. They check in. They update. They remind. And in doing so, they reduce their impact. The man who communicates sparingly but effectively stays present longer. His words carry weight because they are not constant. His attention feels earned because it is not automatic. I noticed that women leaned in more when I said less. Not because I was withholding, because I wasn't flooding. Flooding overwhelms. It leaves no room for response. I also learned that being unpredictable doesn't mean being erratic. Emotional unpredictability is unattractive. Behavioral unpredictability is intriguing. Your values don't change. Your boundaries don't shift. Your direction remains steady. What changes is your availability. When you're always available, your presence becomes background noise. When you are selectively available, your presence becomes an event. That selectivity signals value. It implies that your time is allocated to things that matter, that being with you requires alignment, not convenience. Most men believe that if they don't maintain constant contact, the connection will fade. The opposite is true. Constant contact drains novelty. Space preserves it. Distance is not the enemy of attraction. Familiarity is. When I stopped trying to be memorable through repetition, I became memorable through absence. Absence creates contrast. It sharpens presence. When you are not always there, being there matters. I stopped sharing my schedule. I stopped announcing availability. I stopped justifying delays. My life continued. And when we connected, it felt intentional. Felt. That intention is felt. Women are not drawn to men who are always around. They are drawn to men whose presence feels chosen rather than habitual. Habit kills romance. Choice sustains it. Mystery is simply the discipline of not giving everything away too soon, of letting things unfold, of allowing the other person to participate in discovery rather than being handed the conclusion. The man who keeps something unresolved invites curiosity, and curiosity is the beginning of desire. When you remove mystery, you remove the reason to lean in, and without leaning into attraction, has nowhere to go. Scarcity distorts behavior. When one woman becomes your only option, every interaction turns heavy. Every message feels consequential. Every delay feels dangerous. You stop responding to what's happening and start reacting to what you fear might happen. I lived in that state longer than I care to admit. When she was the center of my romantic world, her moods dictated mine. Her availability shaped my schedule. Her interest determined my confidence. I wasn't choosing her. I was orbiting her. That imbalance changed everything. When you have one option, you can't afford mistakes. When you have one option, you interpret neutrality as rejection. When you have one option, you invest too early and too deeply. You don't let attraction develop. You demand it. And demands are felt. Abundance is often misunderstood. Men hear the word and think it means being a player. Chasing validation from multiple women, collecting attention. That's not abundance. That's insecurity multiplied. True abundance is internal. It's knowing that your life doesn't hinge on one person's approval. It's having enough direction, purpose, and engagement that rejection doesn't feel like collapse. Dating multiple women early isn't about manipulation. It's about avoiding emotional concentration. It keeps you honest, balanced, grounded. When she is your only outlet for connection, you bring pressure into every interaction. When she is one of several possibilities, you bring presence. Presence feels different. I noticed how my behavior changed the moment I stopped treating each interaction as final. I listened more. I reacted less. I stopped trying to secure outcomes. I let conversations breathe. Not because I didn't care, because I didn't need. Women feel that distinction immediately. The man with options doesn't panic when plans change. He doesn't chase when she creates distance. He doesn't interpret every shift as a threat. He remains steady because he is not betting everything on one outcome. That steadiness is contagious. When a woman senses that a man's emotional world is not fragile, she relaxes. She doesn't feel responsible for his mood. She doesn't feel trapped by his expectations. She experiences freedom. Freedom increases attraction. Pressure destroys it. I also realize that abundance isn't only romantic. It's professional, social, physical, personal. A man deeply engaged in his work, committed to his training, and connected to his friends doesn't cling to early romantic signals. His identity doesn't shrink to fit one interaction. The scarcity mindset makes men overvalue attention. A text becomes a reward. A date becomes proof. A compliment becomes currency. And because those things are rare in his life, he assigns them excessive meaning. That meaning leaks out. It shows in excitement that's too intense, in disappointment that's too sharp, in reactions that are disproportionate to the moment. Abundance smooths those edges. When your life is full, attention becomes pleasant, not necessary. Interest becomes enjoyable, not defining. You respond instead of react. I saw how women responded differently to men with options. Not because they felt threatened, but because they sensed value. Social proof operates quietly. The man desired by others appears desirable. Not because women compete consciously, but because value leaves traces. The man who has options doesn't advertise them. He doesn't hint. He doesn't posture. He simply moves through the world with ease. And that ease communicates confidence without effort. Confidence isn't loud. It doesn't assert. It doesn't explain. It rests. Men who pretend to have options are easy to spot. Their confidence collapses under pressure. Their behavior shifts when challenged. Their reactions betray attachment. Real abundance doesn't change under stress. I learned to keep my emotional investment proportional. Interest grows with shared experience. Commitment follows demonstrated alignment. Exclusivity comes after trust. When you invert that order, you create imbalance. When you ask for commitment before trust exists, you expose fear. When you demand exclusivity before connection has formed, you reveal scarcity. Women sense when a man is trying to lock them down to protect himself, and they pull away instinctively. Abundance removes that impulse. When you know you'll be fine, regardless of outcome, you stop forcing outcomes. You allow them. I also learned that dating multiple women early clarifies preferences. It prevents projection. When one person holds all your attention, you project ideals onto them. You ignore incompatibilities. You overlook red flags. Options create perspective. Perspective keeps you grounded. Grounded men don't chase validation. They don't rush definition. They don't cling to potential. They let reality reveal itself. And that calm, measured approach feels rare in a world of emotional volatility. Scarcity amplifies anxiety. Abundance quiets it. The shift didn't make me detached. It made me honest. I stopped pretending interest where it wasn't earned. I stopped over-investing where alignment was unclear. I stopped confusing intensity with depth. Depth takes time. Time requires patience. Patience requires security. Security comes from abundance. When you build a life that offers multiple sources of meaning, romantic interest becomes additive rather than essential. And that orientation changes everything about how you show up. You are no longer auditioning. You are evaluating. You are no longer chasing. You are choosing. You are no longer afraid of loss. You are open to discovery. That posture is felt, and it is attractive. The man with abundance doesn't need to prove his value. His behavior reflects it. His calm under pressure reveals it. His willingness to walk away confirms it. And when a woman senses that a man's life will continue with or without her, something shifts inside her. She leans in. Boundaries change how everything is experienced. Without them, time loses value. Attention loses meaning. Presence becomes cheap. I didn't understand that early on. I thought boundaries were walls, something that kept people out. I was wrong. Boundaries are filters. They decide who gets access and when. When a man has no boundaries, his life is open terrain. Anyone can walk in at any time. Plans shift. Priorities bend. Attention is always available. That level of accessibility doesn't feel generous. It feels unstructured. And unstructured things are not respected. I used to cancel plans easily. If a woman became available, everything else moved. Friends' training work, all of it became flexible. I told myself that was commitment. What it actually communicated was low valuation of my own time. Time is value made visible. The man who treats his time as disposable teaches others to do the same. The man who treats his time as limited forces others to choose. Choice creates investment. When I stopped rearranging my life for potential romance, something shifted. Dates had to be planned. Availability had to align. Being together became intentional instead of opportunistic. That intentionality created weight. Women began to treat time with me differently. Not because I demanded it, because I modeled it. My schedule wasn't a performance, it was real. Commitments existed before attraction entered the picture. This is where many men misunderstand boundaries. They think boundaries are about saying no to women. They're not. They're about saying yes to yourself consistently. When your life has structure, romance must integrate into it, not replace it. The man who abandons his life for a relationship loses the very thing that made him attractive in the first place. Boundaries also apply emotionally. Many men absorb a woman's emotional state without realizing it. If she's anxious, they become anxious. If she's distant, they collapse inward. If she's dramatic, they engage. That mirroring feels empathetic. It's not. It's loss of self. Women test emotional stability through emotional instability, not maliciously, instinctively. They want to know if your internal state is anchored or reactive, if your mood depends on their behavior or your own foundation. When you match her emotional fluctuations, you fail the test. You show that you are not self-regulated, that her emotions control the environment. Attraction does not move toward men who cannot maintain emotional boundaries. The man who remains centered when she creates turbulence sends a powerful signal. He is not afraid of emotion. He is not controlled by it. He does not need to fix it. He allows it to pass without being pulled in. That composure creates safety. Safety doesn't come from reassurance. It comes from stability. I learned to stop trying to manage her emotions, not out of indifference, out of respect. Her feelings were hers, mine were mine. When she was upset, I didn't scramble to repair it. I listened, I acknowledged, and I remained steady. That steadiness changed the dynamic. Drama lost its leverage. Emotional tests lost their power. There was nothing to push against. Men believe they must engage every emotional moment to prove care. In reality, care is shown through consistency of self, not emotional submission. The emotionally unstable man is unpredictable in the wrong way. His reactions shift with circumstances. His mood depends on approval. His sense of self is fragile. That fragility is felt immediately. It creates unease, not attraction. Confidence is not dominance. It's composure. It's the ability to sit in discomfort without urgency, to tolerate uncertainty without collapse, to experience rejection without resentment. I had to learn that I didn't need to respond to every emotional stimulus. Silence can be a boundary. Calm can be a boundary. Continuity can be a boundary. When a woman tried to pull me into chaos, I didn't resist. I didn't participate. I stayed where I was. That presence became grounding, not exciting in the explosive sense, but reassuring, stable, trustworthy. Women return to stability. The man who panics under emotional pressure becomes a liability. If early dating produces collapse, long-term stress will destroy him. That assessment happens unconsciously and quickly. Boundaries also mean being willing to walk away, not as a threat, as a reality. The man who cannot leave has no leverage. The man who can leave without anger has all of it. Walking away doesn't mean disengaging emotionally. It means not sacrificing dignity to maintain access. When I began to enforce boundaries quietly, I stopped needing to explain myself. Explanations are often defenses. Boundaries don't require justification. They simply exist. That lack of explanation changes perception. It signals self-trust. The man who trusts himself doesn't negotiate his standards. He doesn't lower them to keep someone close. He doesn't abandon them to avoid conflict. Women sense that solidity, and they respond to it. Boundaries create contrast between the men who bend and the men who stand, between those who adapt endlessly and those who integrate selectively. The man with boundaries doesn't close himself off. He opens access intentionally. That intentionality makes being chosen meaningful. When you protect your time, your energy, and your emotional center, you force others to invest to reach you. And investment creates attachment. The easier you are to access, the less you are valued. The harder you are to access, the more your presence matters. Boundaries are not resistance. They are structure. And structure is what attraction builds itself around. What I learned from all of this is uncomfortable, but it matters. The most dangerous moments in life don't arrive when things are falling apart. They arrive when everything looks fine and no one is paying attention to the quiet shifts inside. When you start shaping yourself around approval. When you trade direction for reassurance. When you mistake being wanted for being needed. Real value isn't proven by how hard you try to be chosen. It's revealed by what you refuse to abandon in order to be chosen. Your time, your standards, your emotional center. A life that collapses the moment someone pulls away was never stable to begin with. This lesson goes far beyond dating. It applies to work friendships, ambition, and self-respect. The moment you start needing outcomes to feel whole, you lose leverage over your own life. You rush. You overextend. You tolerate what you shouldn't. And slowly, you drift away from who you were before fear took over. Fulfillment doesn't come from being desired constantly. It comes from building something solid enough that desire becomes optional. Want is healthy. Need is corrosive. Want allows choice. Need creates dependence. A meaningful life isn't one where everything feels good all the time. It's one that still makes sense when things are uncertain, when approval is absent, when outcomes are unclear. Strength is staying grounded in those moments without scrambling for relief. If this message resonates, I'd like to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? And if you want more conversations like this, calm, honest, and grounded, consider subscribing. Not for motivation, for clarity.